So if I hear Raphael correctly, he's saying we need more social scientists. Psychologists to the rescue. We're going to talk about a lot of things today. I have been promising this to a lot of people for a while. Yes, we are going to talk about flying penises today. So brace yourself. I've gotten the feedback before when I give talks. I gave a talk where I headlined the first Inter-University Climate Summit in the Netherlands, and the feedback I got is, the French woman is intense. I want that printed on a t-shirt, please. So brace yourself. Okay. So when I wrote Pedagogies of Collapse, which is a book that apparently the Hungarian was the first translation, and people were like, why Hungarian? I don't know, maybe Hungarians love to talk about the end of the world. I'm married to one, so I should know. One of my key insights as a psychologist when I started dealing with this topic, which I entered through the domain of education, is I started to work particularly with a Canadian psychologist, Pamela Armitage, who specializes on trauma. And with her, I went through the classical canon of trauma literature, and I realized, well, actually, what we're going through all collectively is a form of trauma. And the economic system that we live in already has underlying it a lot of vectors of trauma. I worked, as I explained yesterday, in communities in sub-Saharan Africa and in India, and what I saw there is that young children are raised in much more holistic environments. A true village raises them, let's say, which is not the case in the civilizations in which we all grew up, with the nuclear family, as I argue in my book, not being sufficient to provide the emotional resources that most children need to grow up healthy. And let's not even talk about the school systems, especially for those of us that were, let's say, traditional Eastern European schooling system in primary school, traditional rural French schooling systems were not exactly conducive to healthy emotional development. So we are all subject already to what the Hungarian psychologist Gabor Mate called small t trauma, which leads to conditions like complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, what collapse does is it amplifies an already weakened resilience, emotional resilience among people. So what this does, first of all, we are seeing, even though there has been a decline since World War II, with the increase in prosperity, we had a decline in what you call big T trauma, acute trauma. We're seeing that this is now once again amplifying. So things like war, and we have a lot of Ukrainian refugees that have also come in the Netherlands. I work with a charity that hosts 9-10-year-old children from Ukraine. You see the war trauma there in those kids very prominently. Climate disaster. So I haven't spoken to people in Valencia, but I would conjecture that there is going to be a high rate of post-traumatic stress disorder among people that survived these kinds of climate disasters. And specific traumas associated with displacement, particularly, and I know that I have to be careful what I say because I'm in Hungary here, but migrants who flee conflict zones, especially, for instance, Syrian migrants or migrants who flee from Africa and try and flee to safer places to go, but have to deal with not being wanted in the places where they arrive. And then we have medical trauma. And I know what I'm talking about as someone with a chronic illness. The consequences of collapse, and I'm not just talking about disasters here, but we know, for instance, that increasing the heat in the system, when you have more heat days, you have more deaths. It's quite simple. Vulnerable people will die in larger numbers when you have more heat in the system. Poisoning. We're just beginning to understand the impact of having PFAS and plastics all over our bodies, also in terms of our reproductive health, chronic inflammation, cancers, etc. And all of this creates a medical trauma where people are thwarted in their ability to live their lives by being poisoned, simply by the way that we produce and discard chemicals into the environment. Then, on top of that, collapse accelerates systemic traumas. So class traumas, because you see that people from lower socioeconomic classes get hit harder. They are the ones who, in response, then put people like Donald Trump in power. The racial traumas, as I explained, We know that the consequences of climate change are not fairly distributed, and that people in poorer communities, people in colored communities are affected harder. Gendered, we know that women are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate and other environmental disasters. And state-sponsored. When I say state-sponsored, I mean that decisions to invade or not, decisions to support or not, decisions to cut funding to certain mitigation programs or not are decisions that are made at the state level that can mitigate or worsen trauma. And interpersonal trauma, and this is something I talked about yesterday, this was one of my most shocking discoveries, is the extent to which domestic abuse, particularly towards women, accelerates in times of collapse due to increased use of drugs, particularly drugs that make people violent among especially male populations. Sorry about that. That was a bit of a depressing entrance into this discourse. I promise you we'll get to the flying penises. So in my work, in my book, I used psychoanalysis to try and explain why we are so bad at dealing with this trauma. And I particularly used a theory from Melanie Klein, which is object relations theory for those who are interested. And show of hands, who knows psychoanalysis here? Okay, a few people, okay, this is gonna be fun. All right, so Melanie Klein goes back to her early childhood, and she says, as young children, when we're born into this world, we cannot understand our separation from our mothers. And to cope with the psychological trauma of being born, we split the world as infants into good and bad. And she starts off with the first thing the child identifies in the world is the mother's breasts, because that's food and comfort. So when the breast is there, that's good mother. When the breast is gone, it's bad mother. The child cannot conceptualize that this is the same person. And that's called a paranoid schizoid position. Schizoid as in you split. It's called splitting. The idea is that when you grow up, you learn a concept called ambivalence. And that means that you learn, and this is called the depressive position, you learn that actually things are neither black or white. Things are a bit more nuanced and complex. So a small child will confuse their inner emotional states with the outside world. So their feeling of happiness or anger is confused with the mother, and then with other objects. If you see children putting objects in their mouth, the theory is that they try to literally swallow objects because they confuse it with their emotions. As adults, we are supposed to know that our inner emotions are different from the outside world. But when adults are faced with great trauma or great stress, they will regress into a childlike state mentally, where instead of being in this place of ambivalence where they can tell the difference between inner and outer worlds, they go into the paranoid schizoid position and once again confuse their feelings with the outside world. So then, if they're happy, they confuse that with something good in the world. I'll give a concrete example. And if they feel angry or sad, it's called projection. They project that onto external objects. So the theory I came up with is like little children, we fantasize that we have swallowed the planet. So we have swallowed the planet, and we are now collectively in a paranoid schizoid relationship with the planet. The planet is Mother Earth. And we have swallowed the planet, so we confuse our own emotional states with Mother Earth. We project our feelings onto the planet. So we've split our good selves, our altruistic selves, our community-oriented selves, the self that wants to give to charity, the self that wants to rescue a kitten if it's trapped. That self is now confused with good Mother Earth. The goddess Mother Earth, the beautiful water, the fountains, the forests, the butterflies, the bees, everything we want to protect. That's our good nature projected onto the planet. And then there's our bad self, the consumer's self, the self that wants to kill people when it's frustrated, the self that prioritizes itself over other people, our destructive tendencies. And we confuse that with the bad Mother Earth. Hurricanes, wildfires, storms, floods. And we have split the earth into good mother and bad mother. And you can see, because we're talking about psychoanalysis, you can see where this is going to go. Who will tame the bad mother for us so that we can get the warm embrace of our loving Mother Earth back without having to change our own behavior towards the Mother Earth. Enter the men with their potent phalluses, who will play our daddy figures to come and rescue us from the mother and make the mother obey, tame the mother. This is a concept I developed from my book called Phallic Techno-Magic. I have no idea how Balázs translated this into Hungarian. We're talking, and people thought I was exaggerating when I started talking about this, but Elon Musk is obsessed with his phallus. He's trying to put as many kids as he can onto the planet. He's at 14 now, but he hasn't stopped trying. He's obsessed with natality. That is Jeff Bezos' literal rocket. He literally sent Katy Perry, the ultimate feminine figure, in a flying dick into space for 11 minutes. Now, perhaps I'm being a little literal, but come on, what was wrong with the Ariane 6 shape of the rocket? And the idea behind this, of course, this is the absurd manifestation of their omnipotent godlike fantasies, what we call narcissistic delusions in psychoanalysis. But we are literally penetrating the earth to get mining. We talked about mining this morning. What is mining but penetrating the earth with technology in order to tame it? We're going to tame it with renewables. Space conquest is the ultimate phallic delusion, of course. Obsession with natality, and there is a very dangerous undercurrent that we have been talking about amongst ourselves at the apartment, long-termism. It is a philosophy that the present doesn't matter. All that matters is the people in the future, because there's way more of them, supposedly, than there are of us. And long-termists, and I do actually read all the books that I criticize, so I read William McCaskill's book, he fantasizes about uploading a perfect species, so eugenics, a perfect species onto silicon chips to send into the space, to populate the galaxy with happy consciousness based on ideal probably white men. This is like, I'm serious, these guys are literally taking a page out of the eugenics book. They're not even joking about it, and this is Elon Musk's favorite book, by the way. But they know that it's bullshit. How do we know that they know it's bullshit? Read Survival of the Richest by Rushkoff. They're building bunkers to escape the consequences of their own bullshit because they know they're going to fail, and they want to hide out the apocalypse. And they went to Rushkoff, who was a consultant, to ask him whether they should put exploding collars on their private armies to keep them under control when collapse happens. So we understand why these men think they're gods. I think it's fairly, other than the I don't want to know what kind of trauma in their childhood, but obviously they're compensating for a lot of things by these grandiose narcissistic delusions. But the question I had in my book, and I wanted to ask especially young men, and I'm not even joking here because those of you who have sons know about Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson and the manosphere and how that's taking over with toxic masculine identity that leads us into this kind of phallic delusion. Why do we love dickheads? And of course I'm referring to Jeff Bezos' rocket here, nothing more. So why do we love dickheads? I'm going to get really psychoanalytical, but I think fundamentally we want to be children. We don't want to change. We don't want to adult our way through this. We want daddy to rescue us so that we don't have to do the really hard work of changing our behaviors. Cowboy billionaires promise us that they're going to save us from having to take drastic action. Don't change anything, Elon to the rescue. They indulge our desire to not take responsibility. There is a term in psychoanalysis, it was developed by the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion, which is basic assumption groups, which is what happens in a group when our rationality goes out the window. So a basic assumption group is a group of people with no rationality that operate together, and one of the principles along which they operate is dependency. Looking for a god, basically. So a dysfunctional group, and I think as a planet we're now a dysfunctional group, we're looking for God to save us, a messiah. And by the way, one of the other groups is a pairing group where we fantasize that two people will get together and produce a messiah. So I told my students, picture Musk and Trump. And I'm going to here borrow from the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who says we derive perverse enjoyment, jouissance in French, from Jacques Lacan, the psychoanalyst. We love being chastised by a billionaire about how mediocre we are, because that provides us with an excuse for not rescuing ourselves. Oh, please tell me, Jeff Bezos, how mediocre I am. Yes, I cannot do anything to save myself because you are a genius and I am not. We love it perversely because we're little children. And it reminds us of kind of the toxic patriarchal ways in which we were treated as children, let's be frank. So how do we get beyond that? We all collectively need to learn some ambivalence again. We need, and here I also borrow from the psychoanalyst Renée Lertzman. If you're interested, she's written the most extensive psychoanalytic perspective on apathy in environmental questions. She's an American psychoanalyst. So how do we get to ambivalence and resilience? You first need to accept that you have both good, constructive things within you, altruism, good social emotions, and destructive emotions. You have the potential to be both creative and destructive within yourself. You have both, and you need to accept that you have both. And you need to accept that you are not the planet. You are two separate things. You can't project yourself onto the planet. So you must accept that you are both a force for environmental good and environmental destruction, and that the world gives and can also take away. So that's a starting point, but how do we even do that? We've been so used to this paranoid schizoid splitting. Lertzman recommends particularly reparations as the first step towards breaking the charm, let's say, of phallic techno-magic, although she doesn't use the term, that's my term. But one of the things she says is to literally work with your hands in the soil. Not because you can replace agriculture as we know it now in an instant by working and growing your own vegetable gardens, but because it breaks the psychological hold of consumerist, I cannot do anything mentality. So what she said, and she did actually empirical research on this, is when people work with their hands in the soil, the feeling they have of healing nature, when they do that, it eases some of the guilt. And she said one of the main reasons people fail to act, it's not that they don't care, it's that they care too much, but they feel so guilty for their contribution, because deep down we know that daddy's not going to save us with his big phallus. So the guilt incapacitates us, and we need to get over that if we want to get things done. So the first thing is to articulate a capacity to talk about what we have lost, what we will lose, and make amends. This is what we call climate grief, or collapse grief. When I started this work in 2018, and I did empirical studies, I interviewed young people, a lot of whom had the Elon Musk fantasy. And I saw in my data, I was like, whoa, this looks like grief. I'm seeing denial, anger, bargaining. Oh boy, was the bargaining strong among engineers. And depression, very much among philosophy students, for some reason. So I was like, and I go to my principal investigator, because I was a postdoc at the time, like, I'm seeing grief here. She's like, you can't say that. It was a school of engineering. She was like, you can't say that. That's not true. And it took Ashley Kunslow publishing a very brave paper on climate grief in Nature for this to be accepted, even though indigenous people had been saying this for a very long time, for grief to be accepted as the main process through which we're going. And denial is basically the first stage of grief. And why so many people are stuck in denial is because we do not have the capacity collectively to talk about what we're going to lose. I heard some great presentations today. What I didn't hear are actual words to speak to what you're going to lose. Your house, your kids might die. You might die. Your job, your food security. You might become a refugee in your lifetime. We need to say those things out loud, beyond the graphs. We need to be able to talk to mothers, to young men who wonder, what does that mean for my role as a provider if the capacity to provide will be taken away? we need to speak to these fundamental identity questions if we want to get anywhere with our graphs. We've been throwing graphs at people since 1972. How did we do with that? You see any positive change towards more resilience? I think we need to try another strategy. So this is my journey towards psychological resilience and what I've done to repair and build community. I used to be a human rights lawyer. I worked for the Red Cross. That was my first mission. I look very young on that photo. I worked in sub-Saharan Africa. My crisis of consciousness came when I was working in Vietnam on Agent Orange project with victims in the Mekong Delta. And I realized I cannot build community resilience if I am not of that community, if I am not at least attempting to be part of that community, which is super hard when, like me, you have never lived where you were born. When you speak like 4 or 5 languages and you've lived all over the world, it's very hard to build community. But on the other hand, you have a great capacity to borrow from humanity. So you can be the greatest humanist to build those communities. So I built my own community, the Fair Fight Foundation, 10 years ago, where we founded schools for girls using karate, because I'm a second dan black belt myself. So I used what I knew best, which was martial arts, as a tool of embodied resilience, using my body to process stress. And people thought it was a good idea, so we teamed up with local karate associations in Zambia, Zimbabwe, India. For 10 years, we've been running these programs, and then we partnered with nuns, we partnered with teachers, we partnered with parents, we partnered with community leaders, and we sent girls back to school. We have a girl who finished law school, we have a girl who's finishing medical school, we have a girl who's finishing social work. And all this has been, that's actually Tinashe. I fostered her for almost 10 years. She's now living in Estonia, having finished her master's in law and working for a tech company. I met her, she was homeless, living in the slum. So things are possible if you decide to build community, to ground yourself, to root yourself, and not change the whole world, but start with where you are, where you're invited, where you're welcome, and build communities. And the last is my last project, which I really want to talk to you about. It's the Bildung Climate School in Rotterdam. So after I quit my scientific career, because I was writing bullshit papers that nobody cared about and nobody read, and my breaking point came during COVID, when the chief editor of a journal asked me whether I had self-identified the gender of my participants in my study, and I was like, what the F? And I quit. And I had an interview for the most prestigious research grant in the Netherlands, and I didn't go. Instead, I decided to dedicate my career to building impactful communities where I was in Rotterdam. Even though I'm not from Rotterdam, I improved my Dutch. I learned to work with local people. The Bildung Climate School is a third place. I don't know if you know the concept. It's like a place where political communities are built. It's not located at the university, even though it's supported by the university. It is a place where working class kids who are doing vocational education, kids who are doing applied education, and kids from the university come together in an embodied learning, artistic, creative, music-based, and science-based climate program in which they engage in projects with local companies in the community to actually build something with their own hands in mixed groups between social classes and between genders and between ethnic origins. So they have to leverage each other's skills in order to succeed. Either the group succeeds or they all fail. And it has been one of the most beautiful experiences of my life to work with these diverse groups, to navigate the complexities of these different social dynamics where the kids from Rotterdam South, from the working classes, are like, I can't even survive to the end of the month. What are you talking to me about the end of the world? And to be able to talk to these people and say, you have the power right here, and to tell them, I'm not expecting you to stop climate change. I want you to survive climate change. And that is such a powerful message to give to people that the government doesn't care about. To say to them, I'm not going to ask you to go sit on the A12, that's our big highway to The Hague, and protest and risk getting arrested, because you can't afford to do that. I'm going to tell you, let's build communities together so that when it really gets hard, you have as good a chance as I do to survive what's coming, perhaps even better chance because you actually know how to work with your hands. And that is what I'm going to do until everything collapses. So, thank you very much.